Good evening. I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, February 21st. We begin the newscast tonight with Canada's latest inflation reading. Canada's inflation rate slowed to 5.9% in January, and Statistics Canada says it will continue to slow in the coming months. Headline inflation was down from 6.3% in December. This even as grocery prices rose at a faster pace than the last month of the year. Grocery prices were up 11.4% compared with a year ago. Stats Can says prices for meat, bakery goods, and vegetables all rose faster on a year-over-year basis, while higher gas prices at the pump in January drove up the Consumer Price Index compared with December. A First Nation in British Columbia is set to release the results of a preliminary search for unmarked graves on the grounds of a former residential school. The Sayshot First Nation will be presenting its search results in Port Alberni. This comes after 18 months of planning and operations at the site of the former Alberni Indian Residential School. BC land surveyor GeoScan has been using ground-penetrating radar to detect possible grave sites. And officials say children from at least 100 Indigenous communities attended the school from 1900 to 1973. All right, well, meanwhile, Canadian rail manufacturers are being asked to help keep Ukraine's war-damaged passenger and cargo rail system up and running. Ukraine's state-owned rail company is also looking to build a better, more modern system, which includes making the gauge of the tracks more compatible with the standard in the rest of Europe. This would be no small feat, though, considering Ukraine has 20,000 kilometers of track. Amid ongoing negotiations, the International Olympic Committee is being called on to clarify the definition of neutrality. Canada and the governments of 34 other nations have signed a statement. This comes as the committee seeks a way to allow Russian and Belarusian athletes back into international sports and next year's Paris Olympics. Ukraine's president said Russian athletes have no place at the Paris Games as long as the country's invasion of Ukraine continues. Turning to the Ontario legislature now, where lawmakers are set to return today after a 2-month winter break. Health reform is expected to be on the agenda. This with the province expected to introduce legislation containing health reforms that were promised last month. The bill will include allowing private clinics to perform more surgical procedures and diagnostic tests, among other changes that are designed to deal with massive backlogs. The Trudeau government has yet to respond to an invitation from Japan to have Canada rejoin the International Tropical Timber Organization. It is a global environmental organization that regulates the timber trade. A briefing note from July, obtained through an access to information request, shows that Tokyo has asked Ottawa to be part of the organization. The group works with producer and consumer countries to share knowledge about conservation practices and promote the sale of sustainable timber. While Canada was among the signatories to the 1983 treaty that created the organization, Stephen Harper's Conservative government pulled out of it in 2013. All right, shifting gears to BC-based mining company Teck Resources Limited. It has announced a plan to split the company into Teck Metals Corporation and Elk Valley Resources Limited. Elk Valley Resources Limited will hold its steel-making coal business, while Teck shareholders will receive 0.1 of a common share in Elk Valley Resources for each Teck share they hold, plus 39 cents in cash per share. In exchange for the coal assets, Elk Valley Resources will make quarterly payments to Teck Metals, consisting of royalty payments and preferred share redemptions. Moving to northern Canada now, which is under various extreme cold warnings as a cold front moves across the country. Frigid temperatures are gripping parts of Nunavut, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and Newfoundland and Labrador. Wind chill values are expected to dip to between -40 and -50 in many areas. Meantime, residents of southern Ontario are bracing for another winter storm, which is expected to bring a mixture of freezing rain and heavy snow to the region. A totem pole is back home on BC's Central Coast. Taken from a First Nation more than 100 years ago, the totem pole was welcomed home to Bella Coola last night in a ceremony filled with dance, songs, and speeches. Chief Derek Snow of the New Hawk Nation spoke to hundreds gathered for the unveiling. He said the pole's return from the Royal BC Museum in Victoria represented a wonderful awakening for both the New Hawk community and his family. The Snow family pole was carved by the chief's great-grandfather in the mid-1800s. It was then taken without permission in the in 1913 and added to a collection at the museum. Forum Daily will be right back after the break with a look at Pretendians and Indigenous identity. We're going to be speaking with Dr. Kim Tallbear, Indigenous Studies professor at the University of Alberta, up next. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. A recent CBC investigation disproving a former judge, lawyer, and children's rights advocate's claims of Indigenous descent is stirring up controversy about the extent of Indigenous identity fraud. Until the revelations, Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond had been celebrated among Canada's most accomplished scholars. She was believed to be the first Treaty Indian to be appointed a judge in Saskatchewan in 1998 and was a 2021 recipient of the Order of Canada. Similarly, murky claims to Indigenous ancestry have resulted in controversies involving author Joseph Boyden, filmmaker Michelle Latimer, and Canada's former leading Indigenous health scientist Carrie Bourassa. On December 13th, Senator Mary Jane McCallum denounced so-called Pretendians in Parliament. She argued that the issue particularly harms Indigenous women by stealing, quote, our voice, our power, and our hard-earned places in society. Well, joining us now to give us more insight into the issue is Dr. Kim Tallbear, professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Alberta. Dr. Tallbear, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you.
And for those who may not be familiar, what exactly is a pretendian and how big of an issue is this in our country, in our institutions?
Pretendian is one word that's used. We might also use the terms race shifter or playing Indian. It's a huge problem. It's a huge problem, I think, in academia, arts, literature, probably government. And it is a person who either totally fabricates their Indigenous ancestry or greatly exaggerates the role of often very distant alleged ancestry in their subjectivity and their identity and who they are. And then often, not always, seeks opportunities that are lucrative based on those ancestry claims.
And just to build on that, what do we know so far about the reasons why Pretendians have to falsely claim Indigenous identity throughout history? And now, as you said, is it purely opportunity-based?
I think it depends on the kind of person. The cases that we've seen breaking in the news are people that were prominent, right? They were writers, they were academics, and they gained a lot of traction, career opportunities, fellowship opportunities, and notoriety based on those claims. Now, there are plenty of people in both the US and Canada that also make exaggerated or false claims. Sometimes they do think they're true, they turn out not to be, to having that ancestry. And so it can be both an opportunistic thing that can bring in financial gain, but it can also be, as anthropologist Circe Sturm has written, about fulfilling this sense of emptiness. And it is often people who are identified or should be identified as white who make these claims, although not exclusively. And she's talked about them finding that kind of subjectivity as being spiritually or culturally meaningless. And they want to find meaning, right? They want to get out of the meaninglessness of that kind of identity claim. And so they will try to manufacture this more spiritual or culturally interesting Native American or Indigenous identity claim to do that. Not everybody makes money from it, but everybody gets something out of it. And it is, in the end, an appropriation of opportunities and resources, quite often from actual Indigenous people.
And one thing that really stands out, especially in these cases where you're getting top scholars, top people in policy in our government being a pretendian, how do they get away with obtaining these positions in Canadian legal, political, and academic institutions in the first place?
Well, because self-identification has been the way that these things are done. So there is a real disconnect between Indigenous community standards of belonging, of nationhood, of kinship, and this idea of individual self-identification and choice in settler institutions. And we've seen Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond and other people say, well, this is private. I don't have to disclose this. When you're Indigenous, when you're a member of a nation, it is very common to say, who are you? Who are your grandparents? Who are your parents? Who's your family? Who claims you? This is not a private matter, one's belonging to an Indigenous community. And, but settler society thinks that it is because they're used to quote unquote identity claims being individual types of claims. And in fact, identity is a really bad word for what we're talking about. We are actually talking about Indigenous belonging, community, and collectivity. So you have this kind of collectivist ideas going up against these individualist ideas that settler society has. And that's why I say there's a disconnect in how we understand this idea.
All right, Dr. Talbert, a quick 30 seconds left here, but for some further perspective, how is the issue of pretendians impacting efforts toward reconciliation overall in our country?
Well, reconciliation is about changing what you know and thinking about Indigenous people. It's about learning about Indigenous people. It's about changing the way you behave. Pretendianism is just one more form of appropriation of Indigenous resources to build up the wealth and power of white settlers. That is how it is not at all different from the past. It's just more colonialism.
Clearly an issue that needs to be addressed. Dr. Talbert, again, thank you so much for your time today.
You're very welcome.
We'll be right back. After the break, we're going to take a look at the impacts of climate change on natural disasters. We'll have that story and more news from around the world up next, so stay tuned. As the world's leaders continue to look at ways to address climate change amid global climate catastrophes that have affected thousands of lives already, there continues to be a push to educate people further on the science behind climate change. Now, this comes as experts warn of the impact of climate change on industries, infrastructure, pandemics, socioeconomic issues, and more. Well, joining us today to give us more insight into the impact of climate change and the scientific evidence behind this is Dr. Gordon McBain, chair of the Canadian Association of Professionals in Climate Change and a professor at the University of Western Ontario. Dr. McBain, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much for inviting me back. I'm pleased to be here.
Now, sir, natural disasters we're seeing crop up around the world right now, the most recent being the earthquake in Turkey and Syria today. So what evidence do we have that links these natural disasters to climate change in particular?
Well, first of all, I'd like to just emphasize that earthquakes, generally speaking, are not related to climate change at all. They're tragedies, as they are really horrific when they happen, but there is no direct connection with the changing climate that's particularly pronounced anyway. But we are seeing an increased number of floods, storms, hurricanes, these kind of things, which are related to the climate system. They're part of the way the system works. We're seeing as the climate is warming, and the evidence is very strong. The latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, written by a global group of experts, basically said it is unequivocal that the climate is changing due to human influence, that the greenhouse gases and other things we're doing are causing the climate change, and that is quite pronounced now. It's amped up in the last decade or more, so that their statements are much stronger than they were even when they wrote their last assessment report in 2013-14.
Now, I really want to build on what you said in terms of human influence on climate change. So, one of the top arguments among climate change skeptics is that these changes in measured temperatures are part of a natural cycle rather than being directed to human behavior. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the evidence that connects human behavior to these temperature changes?
Well, we look through and understand the way the climate system functions. The scientists, and it's a field I've worked on for now several decades, look into the way in which the climate is warming. And if you look at the data, particularly since roughly the last 50 years, we are seeing a increase in temperatures from almost no change relative to where it would have been in a normal situation to over a degree Celsius. And you say, well, a degree Celsius may not be too large, but a degree Celsius is quite significant compared to, even going in and out of an ice age is only 7 or 8 degrees Celsius global change. So when we're talking about global averages, a degree Celsius, and we're actually now close to 1.2 degrees Celsius warming, is quite substantial. And the should be noted that that value of 1 or 1.2 degrees Celsius, that is the global average. And in the way in which the climate system works for Canada, we're roughly 2 times more than that. So when we say 1 degree C global warming, we mean 2 plus in Canada, and in the Canadian Arctic, 3 or 4 degrees C global warming, or not global, but Arctic warming. So the temperature changes are going to impact Canada more substantially than, say, the United States, or particularly Caribbean countries, North African countries, etc. And the evidence is strong now that with this changing climate has come an increased number of heavy precipitation events, strong wind events, and other dynamics that lead to creation of hurricanes. And with the sea level rising, which comes with the warming of the ocean and the melting of the ice, so there's more water in the oceans. With that sea level rise, the coastal cities that are particularly at risk are even more vulnerable now because the sea level that's affecting them and the storms that will come off that sea level are even more pronounced.
Very concerning information there, Doctor. Now, a quick minute left here, but what are your thoughts on Canada's efforts to address climate change? Is there any room for improvement?
Yes, we need to work together nationally and with our international colleagues to reduce greenhouse gas emissions more effectively. Canada, as greenhouse gas emissions per person, is 13 or 14 tons per person compared to, say, most Western European countries that are 7 or 8 tons per person. And if you look within Canada, the numbers vary from 8 or 10 in Ontario and Quebec and British Columbia to 60 or 70 tons per person in Alberta and Saskatchewan, which is primarily just due to the oil patch industry being centered there where they are producing it and delivering it out of the ground.
Interesting to hear the Canadian numbers. Dr. Bain, again, thank you so much for joining us today on Forum Daily. We'll be sure to continue this conversation in the near future. Russia has suspended its participation in the last remaining nuclear arms control pact with the U.S. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is calling on Russian President Vladimir Putin to change his mind about the New START treaty. It capped the number of long-range nuclear warheads either side could deploy while limiting the use of missiles that can carry atomic weapons. Mr. Putin also says that Russia should stand ready to resume nuclear weapons tests if the U.S. does so. Now, that move would end a global ban on such tests that's been in place since the Cold War era. The European Union is urging member countries to provide more ammunition to Ukraine. According to some estimates, Ukraine is firing between 6,000 and 7,000 artillery shells daily. Now, that's around a third of the number of rounds that Russia is using. EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell said Tuesday that he has written to the bloc's 27 defense ministers, urging them to give Ukraine priority on weapons and ammunition. Amid rising tensions around the world, the head of Australia's domestic spy agency says the country faces an unprecedented threat of espionage and foreign interference. Mike Burgess is head of the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, and he says multiple countries are using espionage and foreign interference to advance their interests and undermine Australia's. The spy agency noticed an uptick in online targeting of people working in Australia's defense industry since a nuclear submarine deal in 2021. Mr. Burgess says those targeted by spies also include judges, media commentators, and journalists. At least 6 people were killed and close to 300 others injured after an earthquake hit areas of Turkey and Syria today. The affected areas were already devastated by a quake that struck earlier this month. The 6.4 magnitude earthquake had its epicenter in the worst hit area of Turkey's Hatay province and generated several aftershocks. Today's quake was felt in Jordan, Cyprus, Israel, Lebanon, and Egypt. An international initiative reports that more than 5.4 million people in Kenya will likely experience acute food insecurity beginning in March. Now, this comes as East Africa faces its worst drought in decades. The analysis was published on Tuesday by the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification. It predicted an increase in the 4.4 million Kenyans currently facing high levels of food insecurity. Now, this in a country with a population of about 47.5 million. The current figure represents a 43% increase compared to the same period last year. The U.S. Supreme Court has taken up its first case involving a federal law credited with helping create the modern internet. It's regarding 26 words of a 1996 law overhauling telecommunications that gives companies like Facebook, Twitter, and Google protection from lawsuits over content posted on their sites by others. Justices will decide whether the family of an American college student killed in a terror attack in Paris can sue Google, which owns YouTube. Now, this is over claims that the video platform's recommendation algorithm helped extremists to spread their message. A controversial scientist who set off an ethical debate 5 years ago is hoping to research rare hereditary diseases in Hong Kong. Jian Kui shocked the world when he announced that he had altered the embryos of twin girls, a world first. He was convicted by a mainland Chinese court of practicing medicine without a license and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. 10 months after his release, he announced today that he's been granted a Hong Kong visa and is in contact with the universities and research institutes. He vows his research will comply with ethics codes. A trial of a 4-day work week in the UK, billed as the world's largest, is out with research that seems to support the shift. Findings were released by the University of Cambridge, Boston College, and other researchers this week. They show that most of the 61 companies that participated from June to December will keep going with the shorter hours. They say revenue largely stayed the same over the trial period and even grew compared with the same 6 months a year earlier. The research found that most employees are less stressed, less burnt out, and have better work-life balance. There was also a 57% drop in the likelihood of employees quitting from the same period a year earlier. Back at home, a tradition of building a snow castle in Yellowknife that began 28 years ago is continuing this year. Anthony Foliote, or the Snow King as he is known, says it gets bigger and bigger every year. The castle hosts the Snow King's Winter Festival every March. Throughout the month, locals and tourists take a ride down an ice slide, enjoy a cup of hot chocolate, watch live performances in the Great Hall, or check out an international snow carving symposium. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily.